The program calls for me to talk about the need for an affordable model, but with a framework, it's not just about affordability that matters. It's more than that, and we've heard it again and again at this great conference. We've heard our clients who've been here call for stuff that's easy to understand, and what I like to describe as simple but not simplistic. Our work needs to be clear and credible, and we need to be in a position where we can show leadership and, really importantly, drive education. And I'll repeat that message again and again in the great work that Gavini and Alison took us through first thing this morning. And we heard Marguerite from IKEA and Eileen from the Cleveland Clinic and Jodie from SABIC talk about the need for this as well. It's absolutely crucial because we stand at a crossroads. And those of you who kindly came to my session a couple of days ago heard me talk about us running the risk of being bombed back into the dark ages. But we stand at a crossroads now. If we get this wrong, we face many threats. We're on the road to hell. If we get it right, we really have heaven in front of us. So let's just examine that in a bit of detail. If we get this wrong, if we carry on using the wrong terms, producing incompatible reports with conflicting data, counting what's easy to count, not measuring what matters, not helping our clients to focus on their objectives, then the result's going to be that our work isn't going to be valued. The industry is going to remain confused. Our clients aren't going to be able to prove their value. We're not going to be able to attract the great new type of staff that we've heard that we need to be recruiting. We're not going to be able to retain and develop our workforce either, because they'll be demotivated by the lack of respect that some of these poor metrics can generate. Mike Daniels talked to us about the opportunity of the 33 billion market research industry, that market that we should be moving into and expanding into. We're not going to be able to do that either. We're not going to be fit for the future. We're not going to avoid commoditization and the platforms. But if we can get it right, if we can use common language, adopt standard approaches, use consistent and credible metrics that are transparent, that are easy to understand, that answer this need for simplicity, if we can add value by advising our consultants on top of the information of these platforms, then the rewards will be great. Our work will be valued. We will feel better about ourselves. We'll be able to retain and attract the best staff. We'll be able to grow the market. We'll be fit for the future. And we'll build great businesses, which surely is what all of us here want to do. So it sounds simple, right? But it isn't simple. So why isn't it simple? Well, those of you who were here with me the other day heard me talk about how stuff has changed. The old days was measuring top-down communication. In traditional media, it was so much easier. But now we all know these type of images. It's about conversations. It's about networks. It's about ecosystems and analyzing and measuring in that. Remember what I said about the old metrics. Many of them don't work anymore. Remember the warnings about the new metrics. We need to be careful about coming up with proprietary scores because it confuses our clients. We hear it again and again. Keep it simple, keep it consistent. But the good news was that the more things have changed, the more they've stayed the same. We've got some very clear needs then. We need to focus on credible metrics tailored to objectives. We need to minimize confusion. We've done some great work already. Let's not forget that. So the AMEC glossary was launched last year. It's on the AMEC site under social media. You'll find it. The transparency methodology table, that's also been launched a year ago. I'd urge you all to be using it if you're not. The Conclave has produced the social media standards, which people have been tweeting out throughout the conference, where you can download them all in one place. Our next challenge is to take this consistent language, this consistent approach, these consistent standard metrics, and help our clients to measure their work in a way that's tailored to their different objectives, because we all know different clients have different objectives, so that's why we can't have a silver bullet. But it doesn't mean we can't have a consistent approach which allows flexibility. And that's where the Valid Metrics framework comes in. And over the years of my involvement with AMEC, it's been one of the biggest successes that we had before with the original Valid Metrics framework. We heard Andy West from Hotwire talk about how he's built it into Hotwire's PR agency, a leading PR agency's evaluation process. But it didn't work as well as it could have done in social media. It needed to be adapted. And of course it needs then, let's just recap, to be simple to understand, but not simplistic. Credible and meaningful, flexible and affordable. It needs to work from the smallest client doing it themselves to scaling up to your biggest international clients. So I chair the social media measurement group, and I've really privileged to do so, and I work with some really smart people, and those of you in the room who've been on that group, thank you very much. But one of the nicest and smartest people that I work with is Don Bartholomew, who it's my pleasure to introduce to you, because Don's going to take us through some fabulous work that he has led for our group on how should this valid framework work in social media. Don's going to show us two different framework approaches. He's led me through the work, we've worked together on it. It's great stuff, and I urge you all to embrace it. Go back to your countries, your offices, your regions, start using it immediately. Adopt it, promote it, use it in your reports, use it in your pitches, blog about it, talk about it when you're on conference platforms, and let's make sure that it's used. But I'm going to hand over to Don now, and Don's going to show us what this great work's all about.
All right, as Richard alluded to, this has been very much a journey and a process we've been on, and we're basically trying to go from navigating with this evolving set of proposed standards, and I would suggest they're proposed standards at this point until people start using them, because these are going to be de facto, right? If we get a critical mass of companies, agencies, suppliers, all using them, they become standards. Right now, they're proposed standards. And we've been on a bit of a journey to how to apply the emerging metric standards to something called social media measurement, which is really where we want to go. Metrics don't have really a use other than help us understand measurement. So let me take you through kind of the journey we've been on, where we've ended up, and then we'll look forward to your questions. Okay. First of all, one distinction, we're trying to develop some standard metrics, and by that primarily we mean definitionally. So when we say impressions in our business, what do we mean by that? What does reach mean? What does an item mean? What does a mention mean? Simple things like that, but quite frankly, I've worked with a lot of clients that use multiple agencies, and they'll come to me and say, can you all just agree on what an impression is, because you all talk about it slightly differently. Reach in the advertising industry is used differently than it is public relations. So we've got some basic definitional issues. As our client increasingly becomes the CMO, which we're seeing, and I'm sure a lot of you are, that person looks at disciplines broader than public relations. So it's important that we all kind of work together in an integrated way. So we're developing standard metrics. The frameworks you're going to see are recommended frameworks. We're not suggesting we have to standardize a framework and approach, but we want a recommended way to use the standards. I think that's the right way to think about what we're going to show you. I want to distinguish between a model and a framework. Quite often those two terms are used interchangeably. We're going to use them slightly differently here. So a model is simply a schematic of how some sort of process works. And the process we're going to talk about is social media measurement. So we're going to suggest a model for social media measurement. The current Valometrics framework uses primarily the sales funnel as the model. So we're going to suggest an alternative to that in use. Another important thing about a model, since it is a depiction of a system or a process, it reflects your point of view on how things work. And I think that's why there's so many different models. We're going to show you 12 different models we found fairly easily in the industry. And that's really because people have a distinct point of view on how social media works. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. What we're showing you, you have to have a comfort level around. This is an okay representation, perhaps a little simplified, of how you generally think social media works in the marketplace. So keep that in mind. And then the distinction between a model and a framework is that we're going to add some extra dimensions to the model, and that becomes a framework then in which we can operationalize with metrics. So let me try to bring that to life a little bit. All right, I thought about using this as kind of my conclusion slide of how do we go from metrics and frameworks we just talked about to measurement, but I thought it might actually be helpful for you to start at this point so you have this as a context for everything that follows. So this is a process for social media measurement. A friend of mine, Angela Jeffrey, just published another process that's not dissimilar to this, has a few more steps from the IPR. So there's not a right process, but this one works well in my experience. So like public relations, people ask me a lot of times, how do you measure social media? And my somewhat sarcastic answer back is I don't measure social media. I measure what you're trying to accomplish with social media. So the objectives in social media are just as important as they are in public relations. They need to be measurable. They need to be aligned with business KPIs. That's the starting point for any good measurement program. We're then going to define the metrics necessary to measure those objectives. And importantly, again, another discipline within measurement is setting targets. That's fundamental to good measurement. Measurement fundamentally is about performance against objectives, and you must set targets in order to be assessed. We're then going to populate that model with metrics. We call that operationalizing the model. In Texas, we call that weaponizing the model. Within whatever framework we select, as Richard said, we're going to offer 2 frameworks to you. We then gather, analyze the data, evaluate performance against objectives, and finally we report our results, typically in dashboards or something that's easily digestible by our clients. So that's how we're going to talk about social media measurement. Let's review quickly the Valid Metrics framework. There's a lot of things that we like about the Valid Metrics framework, and these are just a few of them. Not the least of which is it was a really good way to talk about activities, outputs, and outcomes, and to actually link those together with an eye toward driving toward outcomes. It tracks through the familiar sales funnel. There's been a lot, and I'm going to talk in a second about the fact that some people are taking shots now at the sales funnel, but generally, and rightly so, frankly, but rightly so also, this is a very familiar framework for a lot of companies who still use the marketing sales funnel in terms of their marketing thinking. It allowed for multiple applications within a very consistent framework. If you remember, this little box here changed. That could be social media, it could be public relations, it could be reputation. The thought with the Valid Metrics framework is this needs to be flexible enough to accommodate different use cases in public relations. And then finally, it did create this focus on outcomes. The objective is to drive to the right and to drive to target audience effects so we get true business outcomes. So all those were great things about the Valid Metrics framework. However, you may remember if you attended last year, I think Mike Daniels teed up these 2 thoughts is there's some little issues when we start to think about social media relative to the Valid Metrics framework that made it a little difficult to implement, frankly. And 2 of those problems, the first one was really this question of whether or not the sales funnel was the right way to think about social media. A couple of different things are happening there. The sales funnel assumes that you start with a group of people and it progressively gets down to the people who buy your product, and it's always going down. What happens in social media is that people have an awareness of a bunch of brands. They start using social media, and there's a discovery step. There's actually a bulge in the funnel. People discover new brands that they weren't aware of before. That's an important distinction. And then at the end of that funnel, post-sale, there's a recognition that a whole bunch of engagement around brands happens after they buy your product. It's not before. It does happen before as well, but there's another little bulge at the bottom of the funnel that's the post-purchase engagement. You can find various figures for this, but roughly 60%, for instance, of Facebook fans are already your customers. So if you're thinking about Facebook as a way to drive buying behavior, probably thinking about it the wrong way. These people already like you. They've already bought your products. They're looking for something beyond just you trying to sell them something. And then the second one is kind of obvious. In social media, there really isn't a formal set of intermediaries like journalists work in public relations. You can argue influencers play that role to some degree, and I think that's valid. But generally speaking, the promise of social media is direct to consumers. It's two-way conversation. It's all of those good things. So there's some distinct differences. All right, so this is kind of an interesting exploration. Again, we looked using our friend Google and started to look for social media models. I was aware of some of these anyway. But very, very quickly, you can get a lot of competing models in the marketplace. I'll just take you through a few of these. The social media measurement standards.org, which were published yesterday, again, proposed standards in my view, they kind of defined a model by the categorization of the metrics. So if you think about their model, they started with something called reach and impressions, and then engagement and conversation, on down through to post-purchase opinion and advocacy. It's interesting, as Chris mentioned yesterday with Booz Allen Hamilton, there's new entrants now, right? Forrester is a big player in social media. I was in a pitch 2 years ago where we were talking about platforms. So I walk into this big company's conference room. There's 2 analysts from Forrester there. They're going to help them evaluate what we're saying, right? That's a new dynamic. They're taking a customer life cycle perspective. So customers discover content, they explore it, they buy, and then they engage. Again, they're recognizing engagement post-purchase, which is interesting. Our friends at McKinsey took very much a customer journey perspective to social media models. So they start with perception and exposure, go on through again to buying, and then post-purchase behavior. So it's interesting that 2 quote-unquote outsiders to this field traditionally are both recognizing that a lot of engagement happens post-purchase. That's important. Avanas Kaushik, most of you probably know, is Google's metrics evangelist. I write a blog called Metrics Man, but he's the real metrics man. This guy is really, really good at this stuff. And he has a very simple model. Talks about conversation. Those conversations get amplified. People like you. And then that creates economic value for your brand. Simple way to think about it. This is an agency, WCG. The A alliteration, awareness, assessment, action, in creating ambassadors for the brand. And then the one we're currently using at Ketchum, we talk about awareness of content and message, engaging, that creates impact for the brand, and then we try to assign a value to that impact. So those are just 6 alternatives. Here's 6 more. This is something I've been told now by my friends at Weber they're no longer using, but at one time they had a model called ARROW. So it was activities, reach, relevance, outcomes, and worth. Steve Goldner has his model. A guy named Tamer Weinerg has a different model. All interesting, all valid from their perspective. People tried to modify the sales funnel to get this post-purchase piece in there. The advertising industries use the ADA model, awareness, interest, desire, action, forever. And then one that I developed like 3 or 4 years ago that I think Fleischman is still using, fairly simple. We create exposure to content and message, people engage. We try to influence them to drive some action or behavior at the bottom end. Okay, so those were a lot of alternatives. So we needed to, and there were more, this is just 12. So we wanted then to kind of evaluate these and decide, is there a model out there we really like, or is there an amalgam of models that we would like even better? So we developed some criteria to evaluate these, and the first one was that a recognition that no one model is probably going to fit everybody's needs perfectly, but we do think we can get one that fits most of the needs, and that's important. We think this is an important concept, this post-purchase engagement piece of it, and advocacy. One of the questions we ask ourselves, and we came to the conclusion the answer was yes, is since engagement and influence conceptually are so important to social media, a lot of conversation around those 2 big concepts, we probably need to make those explicit in the model. That can't be something that's buried. And again, since models describe how social media works, which of these models actually describe how social media works the best? Is there one that does a better job of that than others? And then finally, a good framework has to be able to accommodate the multiple use cases of social media. I mean, social media is used from customer care to marketing to employee communications. There's a lot of uses, so we need to be flexible. So this is where we netted out. I should say that this language beneath each of these steps, with the exception of this first bucket, is the language that the social media measurement.org organization has developed. This is probably a good point to make one distinction. The coalition was a really interesting bringing together of all the various public relations entities, associations, so PRSA, IPR, AMEC, et cetera, Council of PR firms. There was very quickly a recognition that the PR industry can't really set standards in something called social media when so many other disciplines are heavily, heavily involved in social media. It's kind of funny, people say, who owns social media? There was a big debate, does public relations own social media? My answer is consumers own social media, right? We're all just eavesdropping on that, but a lot of us participate in those conversations. So the conclave was a recognition that we had to involve other people. So participants in the conclave are the Word of Mouth Marketing Association, the Digital Advertising Association, the Web Analytics Association, all the PR groups, big brands. So it's really an attempt to jump up and say we need a bigger coalition, which we're going to call the conclave, that transcends the PR industry. And a lot of this language, the other thing we did was, for instance, in influence, the Word of Mouth Marketing Organization is very influential. So we're adopting their standards as our influence standards. Digital Advertising Association is going to drive a lot of the exposure-oriented metrics. So it's very much a joint effort with really big organizations. But this is kind of how this works. So we start off with exposure, which is simply creating a potential audience exposure to our content and message. Engagement then in two different ways. We're going to talk about interaction that occurs in response to content that we put out, so people engaging with you in your own channels, and then also recognizing that there's conversation of people talking about you that you've earned in social channels because of the strength of your brand and the compellingness of your content. This is, I think, a really crisp, concise definition of influence. Philip Sheldrake, who is an expert in influence, I think I would encourage you to read his stuff, was heavily involved with WOMA in coming up with these definitions. But simply, it's the ability to cause or contribute to a change in opinion or behavior. So it's not the clout score. Sorry if you like the clout score. The clout score really is your propensity to have your content interacted with, which is quite different than changing people's opinions or behavior. I mean, the clout score to me is a perfect vanity metric. It's almost meaningless, yet I wish my score was higher, right? That's how you define a vanity metric. Impact then is simply the effect of the social media campaign or effort on the target audience. And we're grouping the value piece, the dollar sign piece, the euro sign piece along as part of impact. So you can have impact, for instance, shaping behavior, and then you can also have financial impact in some cases. Advocacy, I think, is also a really interesting concept, and this is a very, very, I think, solid definition of advocacy. So it's the act of pleading or making the case for something, and it has to include positive sentiment as a base condition and one of the following: either a recommendation, a call to action to purchase, or suggesting use or a change in the way people think about a product or a brand. I think that's a cool way to think about advocacy. Okay, so that's the model. And remember we said the framework is going to have two pieces. It's going to have a model across the top, so this replaces the sales funnel. And then we have to have something that comes down on the y-axis that actually is the phases. So let me tell you where we came out on that. We got two suggestions here for you to use in different cases. The first one is, and again, this is kind of a keep it simple approach, is simply to look at metrics in three major buckets. I would argue if you think about social media metrics and you try to put those in buckets, these are three really nice ones that will contain pretty much all of your metrics. There's channel-specific metrics, there's programmatic level metrics, and there's business metrics. Just very, very simple way to think about things. And then, of course, in integrated programs, we're going to take a paid, earned, owned approach to things, and we'll roll it out that way. So let me show you how those two things work with some actual metrics in place. Okay, so simply social media metrics, programmatic are those specific metrics tied to your program or campaign objectives. The channel metrics are those that are specific to social channels. So in Twitter, we have tweets and retweets. It only has meaning in Twitter. Talking about this in Facebook only has relevance in Facebook. Repins only in Pinterest, so on and so forth. There are channel-specific metrics that are interesting as intermediaries. And then finally, business metrics. How are we going to actually show how we're aligned in driving the business forward? What typically happens when I look at a lot of social media measurement programs, and people will say, what do you think of this? Typically what happens is way too many channel-specific metrics, because that's the easy stuff to get. Decent job here, but kind of hindered by the fact that most people don't know how to write a measurable objective. So you have to do some fine-tuning here, and then most of the programs don't even address business-level metrics. So the way that, okay. Then here are the definitions, and these come from Forrester Research for paid, earned, and owned. So paid are simply channels you pay to leverage. So it's paid search, it's display ads, it's sponsored tweets, it's that whole group of things. As Rob Flaherty said yesterday, increasingly public relations firms, digital agencies are involved with paid media as well through these sorts of activities. Doesn't mean we're buying broadcast TV, but it does mean that we're using these techniques to help our social media programs. Owned channels are simply that. That's channels you own and control, so it's your website, it's your Twitter channel, it's your Facebook page, it's your blog. It's that set of activities. And then earned is where customers become the channel. So you've earned their conversation, word of mouth, viral. I added proactive influencer outreach because a lot of PR firms do blogger outreach, and the proactive part of that can be considered earned communication. All right, so let's see how that works then with the framework. Now we've taken the model and we're going to add the two suggested frameworks, and then we're going to operationalize that with metrics. So this is how the first one would look. Works the same way as the valid metrics framework if you think about it, because you want to drive as far to the right as you can on the model, and you want to drive down to business metrics. So ideally, if you have stuff down in this lower right corner, you've done a good job. You have a very robust program and a good approach. So this is how it might look with metrics. These metrics, for the most part, I tried to go to these new emerging proposed standards from socialmediameasurement.org and use the actual language that they're using. So for instance, items, mentions, reach, and impressions are all things that are being defined in that document. And simply put, you just go through this whole process at the top and fill in the metrics. I would usually start, if you're going to operationalize this in terms of your clients, I would typically start with program metrics first. So I put that, so sit down and talk about your program metrics, then add channel, and then talk about how you can align this with the business and actually drive forward with this. Typically, you won't find business metrics over here, right? Businesses don't care about impressions, as someone made the point yesterday. If you go into a CMO and he or she says, how are we doing in social media? You say, great, we drove 3 million impressions online this month. Means nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. You got to say how it's driving the business forward. That's a requirement going forward. The other way to use these frameworks, so measurement planning is one use. The other use case that I see a lot of, and I use personally a lot, is diagnostically. So if a client comes to you and said, evaluate our program, tell us how you can make it better, it's really interesting to just plot the metrics across the framework of the current program, develop your much better approach, and show them the distinct difference they're going to see in terms of robustness of metrics with your new approach. So you've got a pre and post or a before and after look at things. It's really, really powerful, and it's very dramatic to clients to say, oh yeah, we were just talking about exposure engagement. We had nothing over here. That's typically what happens is you'll get a lot of metrics over here, nothing over here. And you want it to be much more balanced. All right, so let's look at the other one, the paid, earned, and owned version. So again, this is just the bare one. I should mention that this is the name we're proposing everyone use for this. So we're going to call it the Amex Social Media Valid Framework, just to distinguish from the valid metrics framework. And this is how it might look with paid, earned, and owned metrics. So again, for a lot of us, the paid line is a little bit new. So we made sure we did some research into how people in paid are talking about things. And they use terms like interaction rates and click-throughs and time viewing and completed plays. A lot of us have used those same terminologies. Owned, again, is the properties and channels you own. So you'll see a lot of website-oriented metrics back into the exposure and engagement stages. I'm not going to go through all these metrics. Obviously, you can download all this and digest it. But once you get to advocacy, again, it's things like recommendations, ratings, people that are talking positively about your brand. Creating content for your brand is an important aspect of advocacy. So what are the next steps? As Richard said, this is a bit of a call to action. We'd love for you to adopt use of these frameworks with your company and clients and to start it with your next project. See how it works. Give us feedback in terms of how this works for you. Help us promote it. If you have a blog, make a post about it, which I'll be doing when I get home. At speaking engagements, mention that you're using this. Perhaps this is one of your slides. White papers, any other thought leadership that you personally are involved with, think about whether or not it's appropriate to promote these frameworks. We're going to make the frameworks available in the social media section of the AMEC website. It'll be in an easily downloadable format. We're going to create a written summary, kind of a user's manual, if you will, of this, and there'll be a short video if you just want to tee this up for your colleagues of what they're going to see, a short 2 or 3 minute video to describe their use. And then we would love to get your feedback. We'll kind of course correct as we go along. You know, you could spend another year or two trying to refine all these formats, and for all the reasons all the other speakers have mentioned, that would be exactly the wrong approach. So we think it's better to get out something that we think is really solid and then course correct as we go forward if necessary. You know, for instance, one thing we might do, I think the model is going to kind of preserve, if I had to guess, as we come down to the various ways to think about the model in terms of those guidance down on the y-axis. You know, for instance, one thing Mr. Sheldrake is very big on is business performance management. So we might have a version that has that kind of sensibility and that kind of thinking. If you have clients that are BPM oriented, that might be interesting, just by way of example. And then we're going to try to keep in lockstep with the proposed standardization. So as they receive feedback, I'm guessing there's going to be some course corrections on their side. We'll make sure that we're in lockstep with whatever is being developed on the metric side of things, so we have a nice model and framework of how to use those metrics. And with that, I think we're ready to take some questions. Thank you very much. 15 minutes.
Don, Richard, very good work. Thank you so much. Can you tell us how you feel these are aligned with the standards currently? I know you both have been heavily involved with that, so do you feel like there's a good fit, or do you feel like there's work we could do further to either address things that you've exposed with the framework or vice versa?
Yeah, I think this is on. Two things. If you remember, the model we're proposing is derivative of the socialmediastandards.org classification of metrics. So I think there's 100% alignment there. We've tweaked that first step a little bit because they actually started at reach and impressions, which are metrics that really fall, to our way of thinking, under something called exposure or audience-oriented metrics. So it's a very slight change, but meaningful. And then all the metrics you see populating those current frameworks are all consistent with the standards. And we'll flesh that out a little bit before these are posted finally, so you have the very latest version. I mean, obviously this was done before yesterday's final standard, quote unquote, proposed standard was developed. So I think it's in good alignment. I don't see anything in the short term that we would have to change to be in better alignment, frankly.
Thank you. And And I would just add then the comment, it seems to me, seeing this and then being involved with that standards work, that if we were to take forward both the standards material and then show, and this is how that comes to life, it's an incredible 1-2 punch that I think substantial progress in getting something in front of clients.
Yeah, I think that's right, Eve. The point of this is the standard metrics should feed up into an adjustable framework that can be tailored to each client. And it's there to help all of us add value, prove value, differentiate ourselves, and remain relevant as we move forward with the challenges that digital media brought to us.
I don't really have a question. I just have a comment to share with you guys. And I would say that when I worked in advertising and then in media buying and planning, that one of the things that came into place once we started to put something like this in action, whether it was with the IAB or the Advertising Research Foundation, is that when you have multiple metrics like this, it's important to have one KPI, because when you have all of them or several as your primary metric to determine success, they can or may end up polarizing each other. So you may meet the goal for, say, advocacy, but not necessarily for engagement. So if the metrics come back and they're polarizing, the question is, did we succeed or fail? And so by agreeing with the client up front what that KPI is going to be, that helps to manage expectations on the metric you're going to use to define success, but it doesn't mean that you can't use some of the additional metrics to provide diagnostics into why and how you met that particular goal.
Yeah.
But ultimately, this is awesome.
No, that's a very good point, Janelle. The way we typically think about that is we want to start with the business objectives. What are they doing? We want to understand the business KPIs, to your point, then the social media objectives, and then the metrics to measure social media, and make sure that continuum is in perfect alignment. And then, as you said, something like channel metrics are a good example of something that may not be directly on that path, but represent important diagnostics. So for instance, if you see people aren't going to the website as much as you thought they would, that raises a flag that you need to investigate further and figure out what's going on. Maybe the content's not as good as you thought it was, maybe it's getting served to the wrong people, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very good point, thank you.
Yeah, and what I'd love us all to do is to use it as a planning tool as well. So to take an empty framework to see a client and help them to plot what those KPIs, what those objectives are in there, and it will allow you to have a much better, higher level conversation with your clients and be far more relevant, as I say. But use it, take it in earlier in the process, use it to plan, and that will drive the measurement, and it should be symbiotic.
Question back here from the Peanut Gallery. Margot Savell at Hill & Knowlton and your Conclave colleague. I'm just wondering, with the different metrics, paid, earned, own, seeing a lot lately about shared. The thinking being that we don't really own Twitter, we don't really own Facebook. Facebook gives us the analytics, so it's not really owned, it's shared, and I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I used to work at Fleischman Hillard, and we had what we call the PESO model, which is paid, earned, shared, and owned. Forrester, I think, has been the biggest voice behind paid, earned, and owned without the shared. Basically, here's the distinction. In the Forrester model, earned includes social media, right? And you earn social conversation by the power of your brand, how compelling and interesting your content is, so on and so forth. The public relations people, fundamentally because of this reason that if you think about how a lot of PR firms got into social media, they have very much a media relations mentality in the PR industry. So the first and easy translation, the jumping off point into social for a lot of agencies was blogger outreach, right? Because that kind of felt like media relations. They were somewhat comfortable. And there was a lot of conversation 5 years ago, 6 years ago about, ooh, bloggers are different and you guys are screwing this up by pitching bloggers in the wrong way. I'm sure you'll remember a lot of those conversations. I think most PR people now recognize that there's different protocols when you're working with bloggers. But that was really the reason to break out something So we had paid, earned, shared. The shared part of it then became social, and the earned was this blogger outreach that you were doing, the proactive parts of social media that were driving amplification and further use of social. So that's the difference. You'll notice that my CEO had paid, earned, shared, and owned yesterday, so we're going to have a conversation to get in sync on that, because we're now promoting paid, earned, owned. I think it's fine if you want to use paid, earned, shared, and owned, frankly. I think that is totally a fine distinction. If you want to use that as your framework, that's totally fine. I think the industry, for the most part, most of our clients are talking about paid, earned, and owned without the shared piece. And that was the reason to put that one forward, is I think that's kind of where the industry is. The preponderance of the industry is on paid, earned, and owned, although I think they're both perfectly valid.
And I'd just add to that that I think it's really important that we just keep it simple, and different people have different opinions on what is shared, and I mean, Don's absolutely right the way he's described it, but some people argue about, fine details with that. And really, we need to make sure this is adopted widely. We want to keep it simple. But I'd totally, back Don on his point. If people in their business feel that shared is a valid, there's a case to be made to include shared and to define something as shared, then just slot it into the framework and use it.
Great presentation. Thank you very much. Taking it one stage further, I love the simplicity of it and the ability to tweak it to the different requirements. One of the things that I think is really important for us is to be able to gain that feedback and that feedback loop so that we do have future iterations of it. So would you like to tell people a bit about how they can give that feedback once they start rolling it out and seeing how it's working for them? And I'd also love it if maybe in a year's time we could revisit this with a whole load of case studies of what people have been doing with it and how it's worked, so as to really bring it to life.
Yeah, no, good point, Pauline. So what we'd ask you all to do is, Barry has created a subsection on Amec's website for social media. So from one of the drop-down menus, you can find content there. Jonna Burke has been leading an effort to pull together a whole load of collateral, which we'll be sharing in the few weeks coming up after the conference, and part of that also there's going to be the ability to feedback there, but of course you can reach us in the usual channels to feedback to the group, but the team members of the group will be listed there. So from an AMEC point of view, that's how we'd like to get your feedback that way. And I think you're absolutely right about reviewing it next year. I think, yes, please, Barry, can we have a space, maybe not on a Friday morning, to look at how that's going. And I'd ask all of you to feed case studies where you feel it's worked up to us, and we'll promote it. Feed it through to the group, through to Jonna. We'll promote it. We've got different team members from around the world who've volunteered to translate it as well into different languages, because AMEC obviously is an international organisation, and we want to bring our global colleagues together with us, and we want to help them to do that by doing it in languages and making it easy for them to understand and easy to make sure that we can drive that education throughout the wider PR industry.
We'll take one more question.
I don't see that there isn't any conflict between the paid, owned, and earned and the channel campaign performance. You could easily do paid, owned, earned nested in. Is that the intention? We're not trying to choose between one, right?
No, I had that same thought myself. If you were doing an integrated program and you like the simplicity of kind of the programmatic channel and business, you certainly within programmatic could have paid, earned, and owned. So I think there's a way certainly to work all of those in, either in one box or divide your box into those three elements. I think that's totally fine. Really just reflects it's not binary. You can certainly meld the two. The paid, earned, owned is an attempt to recognize that increasingly we're doing integrated programs that include those elements. And I have some clients who love to talk in that language. Again, these only work if they work for you and your clients, right? So we're trying to make it both simple as well as flexible and sensible so we can actually get people to use it and adopt it and feel comfortable with it.
Okay. Key thing, as Richard has indicated, is keep the dialogue, keep the comments, keep the questions coming into AMEC. Great work. Thank you very much. Thank you.